Hey,
Hello, 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 and welcome. I mean, switch this around here.
Oh
Back
my
to
God.
Night Shift with Andrea up late. How are you guys doing? Welcome back. It's been a week. What is this? Sumo. Good gosh. How are you doing? I'm joined as always by my co-host, the lovely Brian Sanders. How you doing, Brian?
Oh, wonderful now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now we're
We're
probably
on it.
getting going. If you are new here, this is a live YouTube show every Tuesday night, and we're from 4 p.m. to midnight on Tuesdays. And then we drop wherever you listen to your audio podcast within the next couple of days or so. And we're doing something a little different tonight, right?
Yeah, we're going.
Do you know what we're doing tonight?
Yeah. Well, sorry. It says you may have a little echo.
Er,
Oh.
Still? Maybe? That's his fault. Is
I
that
don't know
better?
how I
That should
did
be
that.
better.
I don't know how I did that.
That should be better.
Yeah. Sorry.
All right, you guys let us know if it's not. I apologize for that. Either way, welcome back to Night Shift with Andrea up late. This is Brian Sanders. He's a retired homicide lieutenant, if you are not familiar. And this is a true crime podcast. So his expertise always is very valuable when we discuss cases and scenes and interviews and investigations. So tonight will be no different, but we are doing something different though. So we generally cover Night Shift likes to cover unsolveds or unresolves mostly. I don't know how that's how our channel started going, but it did, and I think it interests me more in terms of like a puzzle, actually trying to figure something out. That's when we get in touch with family members or detectives who have worked a case, or friends of the family, whatever, you name it, or actually the perpetrator themselves. It depends on the show. But this case is different because it is big and it is solved. And so I tentatively titled the episode tonight Go Big or Go Home. It's the Ed Kemper case. So I usually don't do the very big, well-known serial killer cases, even though I know people like to hear them. But I figure there's so much information out there, everybody kind of already knows it. But tonight, I just thought it would be kind of an interesting one to do. And so as we speak, let's see here. I'm going to go on and give you guys a little something to look at here. If you're not familiar, Ed Kemper's case takes place back mainly in the early 70s, 72 to 73 specifically, but some other things kind of popped off in the 60s. And we talk about the fact that between my nursing background and Brian's psychology and homicide background, we oftentimes like to talk about the why behind the cases. And so this case is no different. In fact, I almost named this, I'm not going to. It's a which came first, the chicken or the egg, essentially, because was it that Ed Kemper's brain was wired a certain way at birth? Was it because of a traumatic childhood, pretty terribly traumatic? Or was it, the perfect storm, as Brian will say, of both? So let's see here. I will tell you, though, that, well, I can't find the particular picture I'm looking for, but because when I do, either way, there's a photo similar to this one. And Brian says that we can't hang it in the house. So either way, we're just moving right along with that. All right. So let's get to chatting about it. Last week, you guys, again, we did like an update on the Ellen Greenberg case that has pretty insanely huge new developments after 14 years. And it's all due to the tenacity of her family, her parents specifically, the independent investigators and pathologists that they've hired, and to be fair, deep pockets, because it took so much money to fight the state on this one and the city of Philadelphia specifically. And they have done such an amazing job, and they got an unprecedented ruling last week. And then the city got a little shaky and settled. So either way, we look forward to the very, very real possibility of a new manner of death being put, or should I say the original manner of death being put back on Ellen Greenberg's death certificate. And if that's the case, it will be a death of unnatural causes, a death not by that S word, the unaliving word. It'll in fact be one of unknown or murder causes. And that would lead us to do what?
To
Open an investigation,
solve it.
right? Yeah, and solve it.
Solve it.
Solve
That's
it.
all
Yeah.
I know.
Absolutely. So that would be fantastic. Hey, everybody in the chats, if you're new here, this is also, like I said, a live YouTube show. So we do have friends engaging in the chats. You're welcome to hop on. It's free. Just log into YouTube, and we'd love to have you. We try to answer questions if we can as we discuss a case. And then for sure at the end, when we get done breaking down the story, we like to engage and chat with you guys and answer any questions you may have. So, Brian, this case takes place over kind of a multitude of years. But one of the bigger years involved would be 1973. And as our current pop culture guru, what you got for 1973? What was going on in this world in 1973?
Now, we may have covered 73 in the past. I don't think we have.
Was Annalise Michel the real life Emily Rose exorcism out of Germany in 1973?
Probably.
That feels right.
Yeah, because it did seem like I was finding some similar things. So I tried to go a little more obscure. Right?
Yeah, let's do it.
Have we ever talked about the song "The Night the Lights Went Out in Georgia"?
Oh, I know that song well.
Yes. So that was a big hit in 73. Do you know who sang it?
I know. Who did Ray Charles sing that too?
I think a lot of
everybody's
people covered it.
Reba most famously, but more recently, most famously Reba in the 90s. But
when I was a little bitty child, well, not in 73, I wasn't even on this earth. When I was a little kid, I do remember hearing this version a lot. Vicki Lawrence.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah,
that's right. I did know that. Yes.
Which
is obscure and
for
hilarious.
People out there. She was an actress, comedian.
She's still alive.
Yeah, but I just, as a kid, I didn't know that. Didn't associate it. And then when you actually listen to the lyrics, it's basically a unsolved
It's about
murder.
Philadelphia and Josh Shapiro and I'm saying it. I don't care.
Yeah, but in the song, the wrong person's charged, but it tells you why. Who the real killer
Talks about the brother.
Show and Tell by Al Wilson was a big hit.
Okay.
When I was a little kid, we used to listen to that a lot. I just throwing a random one out there. Hocus Pocus by the band called Focus.
Nice. That's not more random than Vicki Lawrence and The Night That the Lights Went Out in Georgia.
It's not. Debut albums. There's 3 bands that debuted their first albums in 73. Queen.
Woohoo.
Aerosmith.
Okay.
And Leonard Skinner.
Oh, okay. That's dope.
Isn't that crazy?
Yep.
Yeah, I don't know why. I thought Leonard Skinner would have been like late 70s or mid to late 70s, not 73. But I guess that's debut. Well,
when you have 1,500 Van Zants in a row, you can just kind of keep it. You just keep going.
TV shows. Some of the ones I'm just gonna give you a cluster of shows. Seem to be the trend.
Okay.
And we're gonna get into Ed Kemper and why some of this matters with police buffs. But Hawaii Five-0, Kojak, Adam 12. Which is the origin for why police are called 12s. To the old heads, the younger ones have a different reason. TV show Rookies, about 3 rookie cops in Southern California. I don't know. It went for a couple seasons. Show called Barnaby Jones.
Okay.
The actor Jed Clampett. He was a private investigator and worked with his daughter-in-law or something. And then a TV show called The Streets of San Francisco about homicide detectives. And one Michael Douglas, Breaking Role.
Very nice. Now, did you say that these originated in 1973, or they were just kind of
the main?
Well, I say this because Ed Kemper will reference a lot of the mainstay cop shows at the time.
Yeah.
And he kind of used them as tools.
Yeah. A lot of these started in the late 60s. Like Adam 12 was in the late 60s. I think Kojak was probably
and Rookie as well. I believe he actually specifically references Rookie in one of his interviews.
Isn't that crazy? Mm-hmm. We didn't even talk about this.
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty cool.
That is cool.
Movies would have been Serpico.
Okay.
American Graffiti.
Okay.
The Badlands.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I think we've talked about that in the past. And Charlotte's Web. Your favorite.
That's so sad.
And probably other than that, I would like to note that ballistics were pretty prevalent in 73.
Okay.
Remember we had that side conversation? Ballistics go all the way back to 1925.
Okay.
when a
Yeah,
lab
and he
was
knew
built
it.
in New York.
And that was not by happenstance that he did what he did.
Yeah.
You got more? We
Nope.
good?
No.
Okay, so I guess I cannot do this. Without further ado, we will get started. Again, though, just to kind of wrap you guys back to what we were talking about a minute ago, you can always go back to iTunes or Spotify, or even just this YouTube version to watch it if you want, and check out that Ellen Greenberg case from last week if you haven't. I know we've covered it 2 or 3, 4 times at this point, but it's well worth kind of getting that recap, refamiliarizing yourself, and hearing those updates because it's pretty amazing. And my ads kept getting denied. I was trying to like boost certain stories, naming the governor of Pennsylvania and the involvement when he was in the AG's office, linked to Greenberg's case, and can't do it. So we've got a lot of talk of transparency right now, but still can't. Instagram's still not having that. So take that for what you will. All right. Well, I have got 1,000 notes, be it paper, print, phone, otherwise. So let's get started. So California in 1973. We will be talking about California specifically now. What did that look like? All right. So we have the Cold War that's kind of reached a bit of a stalemate. We have tension surrounding conflicting opinions about Vietnam. It's starting to kind of settle. Women were absolutely feeling more than empowered at that time. Watergate had wrapped up. And Santa Cruz, California was being referred to as the murder capital of the world. Yes, Santa Cruz, California, the murder capital of the world. And we will explain exactly why that is. So let's take it back on now. So Edmund Emil Kemper III, okay, so Big Ed, as he is affectionately known, was born in Burbank, California in 1948. Ed was the middle of 3 children. He had an older sister and a younger sister. His parents were, so his mom's name is a bit different, Clarnell, Clarnell. So Clarnell Kemper, she was a Montana native, and his dad was Edmund Emil Kemper Jr., okay, remember Ed's the third. His dad went by EE. He was he was a World War II veteran, okay? So after the war, EE tested nuclear weapons at the Pacific Proving Grounds, and eventually he went back to California to work as an electrician. So pretty smart dude. Again, this is Ed's dad we're speaking of. But his mother, Clarnell, would often complain about EE's job, calling it menial as an electrician. After all this other, after testing nuclear weapons and everything else. Just be glad he's home and alive, right? So EE later complained, like later on after some things went down, that, quote, suicide missions in wartime and the atomic bomb testings were nothing compared to living with Clarnell. So that's what Ed's father later says about Ed's mother. He also once stated that, quote, she affected him more than 396 days and nights of fighting on the front did. So those are some very specific references. And so as you can gather, if that's not a little bit of foreshadowing for you, their marriage does not work out, but we'll get into that. It said that Ed weighed 13 pounds at birth.
Wait a minute.
You heard me.
That might be a world record.
It's not, but that's a big old baby.
Yeah.
I know. My biggest baby was like almost 9. I can't imagine 13. He was consistently larger, as you can imagine, than his peers growing up. So early on, and this is when we start talking about the wiring of the brain, okay? Early on, Ed exhibited behaviors that were really, really concerning. So at 10 years old, Ed, and I don't think I need to give you guys a warning. It's a true crime podcast. There's a million of them that exist. You know what you're getting into, but we will be talking about some very specific yucky crimes as the evening wears on. So at 10 years old, Ed buried the family's pet cat alive. Okay. Ultimately, he goes back and digs the cat up once it had passed away. He then decapitated it and mounted its head on a spike. Ooh. So I'd say that's concerning.
Yeah.
At the age of 13, he thought the other family cat was showing favoritism toward his sister, so he killed it. Then he dissected it, and he kept pieces of it in his closet until his mom eventually found them. So that gives you a little bit into some of his earlier on behavior that was obviously causing alarm. So he was known to harbor like dark fantasies. He had a morbid imagination. He talks about this later as an adult. When he was a kid, he like would take his sister's doll heads and remove them. You might think that on its own isn't so bad. He would sometimes also remove their hands. That's some foreshadowing. On one occasion, his older sister teased him and asked why he didn't try to kiss his teacher, because he had already mentioned having kind of a crush on, he kind of exhibited signs of having a crush on his teacher. And he replied to his sister, if I kissed her, I'd have to kill her first.
Wait, how old was he when he said that? Or was it school age?
This would have been school age, yeah.
Okay.
He didn't, yeah, it's not like if I tell you, I'll have to kill you. It's
right,
if I kiss her, I'll have to kill her first.
Ooh.
So he recalled that as a young boy, he'd sneak out of his house, armed with his father's bayonet, and go to his second grade teacher's house, second grade, to watch her through the windows. He also stated in interviews later on in life that some of his favorite games to play as a child were, quote, gas chamber and electric chair. And when he would play these, he would ask his sisters to blindfold him, and he would sit in a chair and writhe and pretend to die from whichever game they were playing. He also had a near-death experience as a child. Once his older sister actually did try to push him in front of a train. Another time she pushed him into the deep end of a swimming pool where he almost drowned. We'll come back and talk about it, but it is interesting that this is the older sister. And when we learn how his mom treated him, you might wonder if there could be a little, if she may be, mimicking some of her mother's behavior here. He early on had a close relationship with his dad. So he was very, very devastated when his parents split up in 1957. They divorced in 1961. So when they divorced, he went to live with his mom, Clarnell, in Montana. That's where she had been from, so she had moved back there. He had a really horrific relationship with his mom. She was deemed neurotic, domineering. She was a raging alcoholic. And most notably, like, she exhibited physical abuse toward Ed, but I think what he will even to this day state is the emotional abuse was so much more. And so he was belittled by her, humiliated. She would whip him with a belt, but I mean, to the face and, all kinds of areas of his body. So she would often make him sleep in a locked basement. There are some sources that say that she was concerned about what he might do, like if he would harm his sisters. He was already a pretty domineering size, even at 10, 11, 12. But by the time he was 8, if I'm not mistaken, she was having him sleep in the basement. And as an adult, he'll say, I couldn't navigate my feelings with that. It felt like my sisters were going to bed upstairs in heaven and I was going down to hell. And his mom would lock him down there. And he said it was dark and it was, scary for a child, obviously. So by the time he was 15 years old, he was 6 feet 4 inches. Other kids called him a weirdo. His mother called him a weirdo. One time, his mom did not realize that he could hear her on the phone. To be fair, I don't know that she would care, but he overheard his mother on the phone talking to his father, and she had called him a weirdo there. And she also told his father that she refused to show him any affection out of any fear that it would turn him gay. Yeah, and she's been known to say that she was going to raise a real man. But remember, she belittled her ex-husband. She belittled Ed's dad as well. Yeah. She would often tell young Ed that he reminded her of his father and that no woman would ever love him. She multiple times over his coming of age years would tell him that that another woman would never want to look at him, would never want to be around him. He later has described her in many kinds of ways, but he said that she was just a very, very sick, angry woman. Later, psychiatrists have come out later to kind of study her behavior and her background. I don't know a lot about her history as a child, but Ed himself will say his mother had a very terrible upbringing, and psychiatrists have later since stated that it could be a good chance that she had borderline personality disorder. Mm-hmm. So at the age of 14, Ed ran away from home in an attempt to reconcile with his dad. So his dad was over in Van Nuys, California. So he gets there, and once he gets all the way to where his dad is, he realizes that his dad had, by this point, remarried, and there's a stepson in the picture. So his stepmom has a kid. So he stays with his dad for a while, but it's not really going so great. So there were accounts of he and his stepmother just not jiving at all. She pretty much gave an ultimatum to his dad that he was going to have to leave. He would stare at her when she would get out of the shower and things like that. They would also argue. So after a little while, his dad decides that, okay, you've got to go for the safety of this household and the sanctity of this marriage and whatever else you're going to have to get. So at every turn, we talked about this with the Franklin Floyd case as well, but like he's exhibiting bad behaviors, obviously, right? But he's also being turned away at every turn.
Yeah.
So he leaves his mom's, runs away to be with his dad, and he's excited about that. Then between his dad and his stepmom, he's turned away to his then paternal grandparents. Okay, so to his dad's parents. So he goes to live with them on a ranch in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada, about 2 miles west of town of North Fork. Evidently, he hated living there. He didn't like it. Was kind of like a rural, like farm type area. He described his grandfather as senile. He said his grandmother was constantly emasculating me and my grandfather. So his grandfather was exhibiting at this point some kind of increased symptoms of dementia by the time Ed was like 14, 15 years old. And his grandmother was condescending to Ed and his grandfather. And even though these are his paternal grandparents, psychiatrists have later gone on to say that Ed viewed this as kind of an extension of how his mother treated his father and himself. So he would look at his father's parents and see her be this way with, her husband, and then later on with him. So Ed really wanted to go back and live with his dad, but with the way he caused the friction with his stepmom, this wasn't going to be allowed. So the tensions were increasing with Ed and his grandmother. Again, she's behaving similarly as far as Ed is concerned to his own mother. And so one afternoon, the two of them got in an argument. She had been fussing at him. He had a rifle there and he would go outside and shoot at birds. He just kind of was passing the time. And so she came out this day and told him that he better not shoot one single bird. They get in kind of a bit of a verbal argument. And so on August 27th, 1964, when he was 15 years old, young Ed Kemper made a fateful decision and he raised his rifle and he shot his grandmother in the back of the head. He then shot her twice more in the back. At this time, he dragged her body into the bedroom and stabbed her multiple times. Later, he said that he wanted to make sure she was dead. You'll hear this again from him, like this desire, this need to know that they are dead. But this is usually when you already know pretty well that they are. So we got some overkill happening for sure. So Ed looks down at her body now, where he has dragged his grandmother, into the bedroom, and he later says that he was satisfied he'd never have to hear her mouth again. Not long after this, he hears his grandfather pull into the driveway after he'd gone on like a quick grocery run. When his grandfather exited his car, Ed stood behind him and shot him dead. He shot him in the back of the head. He didn't want his grandfather to know that he was being shot. He didn't want him to be hurt, as much as that may make sense to you. But he said he didn't want his grandfather to see what had been done to his grandmother. So in some sort of a twisted sense, he was trying to save his grandfather there. He realized he had nowhere to go. He had no one to call. So he phoned his mother and he said, "I've killed my grandfather and grandmother." So she tells him to hang up and to call the police and tell them what he had done. And so he did. And he told the police later when they get there, he's just sitting on the front porch waiting on them. Okay. So when they get there, he said, quote, "I just wanted to see what it felt like to kill grandmother." So that would be his first time actually acting on these thoughts we later learned that he had been having since he was a much younger child. And again, he was only 15 here. So a psychiatrist, Donald Lundy, who interviewed Ed later on during his adulthood, did write, in his way, he had avenged the rejection of both his father and his mother. So as we discuss this, and you may say this is a bunch of garbage and, he's just evil and it doesn't matter. There's no rhyme or reason. But it is kind of interesting because when we outline, and Brian and I will be talking about this toward the end of the show, but when you look at different ones of, let's say, the more notorious or more well-known serial killers that we have in America, we can kind of look at backgrounds and we can see what their motivation was behind it. And like, did they want to boast? Did they have any remorse? Did they themselves know why they did what they did? Did they care? Did they want to hype it up and make it bigger than it was? So everyone kind of goes about this differently. And I will say pretty consistently with Ed Kemper, we have someone who there's just a lot of symbolism. So whatever he does, he will later, have a reason for it, not to rationalize it, but to say, this is how this made me feel, or it reminded me of this. So Ed's crimes were deemed incomprehensible for a 15-year-old. So court psychiatrists initially diagnosed him with paranoid schizophrenia. At that time, you guys, it was 1964. That was just a kind of a common diagnosis when they didn't really know what to do. They're going to put you in a mental institution and you're going to be diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia or some kind of a schizophrenia. And we learned later that that's often case not the correct diagnosis. And we'll learn that it was not, in fact, either for Ed. Okay. So he was sent to the Atascadero State Hospital. So it was a maximum security facility in Obispo County, and it houses mentally ill convicts. So that was, again, his initial diagnosis. That is not going to be what sticks. So at Atascadero, I put the emphasis on the wrong part of that word every single time I say it. It's called the California Youth Authority. Psychiatrists and social workers disagreed with the court's original diagnosis. So their report stated that Ed actually showed no flight of ideas, no interference with thought, no expression of delusions or hallucinations, and no evidence of bizarre thinking. They also observed him to be intelligent, introspective. Initial testing measured his IQ at around 136. Again, this would have been around 15, 16 years old. But more than 2 standard deviations above average. So your average IQ, let's say, is around 100. Above 119, 120 is pretty superior. So his initial testing, like I said, was at 136. And they decide to re-diagnose him now with a kind of a less severe condition called a personality trait disturbance, passive-aggressive type. And he was given another IQ test a little bit later on in his stay there, in which he scored a 145. So these are pretty high level of intelligence. So he endeared himself to a psychiatrist by being a model prisoner. And to be fair, he's, I think, 73, 76 now. This has kind of stayed the same. He was trained during his time there. He's a teenage boy after this double murder of his grandparents, and he was trained to administer psychiatric tests to the other inmates. A psychiatrist later said he was a very good worker, and this is not typical of a sociopath. He really took pride in his work. I will disagree with that, not typical of a sociopath. Again, this was the 60s, and we've learned since that that's not necessarily the case. But Ed also became a member of the JCs while there at the mental facility, and he claimed to have developed some new tests and some new scales on the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. You guys check this out. Specifically, these are things that, like, programs that he has developed, okay? An overt hostility scale during his work with a psychiatrist. After his second arrest, which we will be talking about, Kemper said that being able to understand how these tests functioned, because he helped program them, allowed him then to manipulate his psychiatrist, admitting that he learned a lot from the sex offenders to whom he administered the tests on. And this is widely talked about when you read about Ed Kemper, because the crimes that he goes on to commit after this time, he learned, a lot of the things were his own fantasies and desires and compulsions, but he himself will say that while his time there, he learned so much about sexual deviancy and these kinds of things from these young adults in this mental institution. So on December 18th, 1969, his 21st birthday, Ed was released on parole from Atascadero. The psychiatrists all but basically said, they were like, look, we think he's fine. They actually didn't think they had no fear of him committing more crimes even. He had done a good job to manipulate. He knew what he was doing while he was there. And he was kind, and he was easy to get along with, and he was intelligent, right? So they said, we don't really have any recommendations except for the fact that he needs to never have contact with his mother again. They're like, that's the only thing we can strongly say, is that there would be no good to come from him having any contact with his mother. Again, however, this is exactly what did happen, and Ed was released into Clarnell's care. So I understand that he's an adult, but you guys, he was an adult after going into a mental facility at 15 years old. So he essentially has 6 years of his teenage years wiped off. And so he's got to kind of get back in the game, get back into life. So at this time, she lived in Aptos, California, and worked as an administrative assistant at UCSC, which is the University of California, Santa Cruz. All right. So he later further demonstrated to psychiatrists that he was rehabilitated. And on November 29th, 1972, his juvenile records were permanently expunged. So the last report from his probation psychiatrist read, so when he got out of that mental facility, he still had to kind of come in per his probation and do these checks. And the last report from the psychiatrist said, if I were to see this patient without having any history available or getting any history from him, I would think that we're dealing with a very well-adjusted young man who had initiative, intelligence, and who was free of any psychiatric illness. It is my opinion that he has made a very excellent response to the years of treatment and rehabilitation, and I would see no psychiatric reason to consider him to be of any danger to himself or any member of society. And since it may allow him more freedom as an adult to develop his potential, I would consider it reasonable to have a permanent expunction of his juvenile records. And they did. And on that last report, when this report was getting written up about him being no harm to himself or others, and he'd, done exemplary in his training and rehabilitation, while this report was being written, out in the parking lot in the car that Ed drove there was actually a young woman's head. So, yeah. So during this time, Ed attended community college courses to comply with his parole violations. Like I said, he'd missed critical years of his life from 16 to 21, and he started befriending local police officers there in Aptos, California, and finally, or Santa Cruz, excuse me. And finally, he decided to try and become a trooper. He wanted to be a state trooper. Interestingly enough, the double murder of his grandparents were not enough to prevent him trying to become a trooper. Actually, though, it was his size. So by now, Ed stood at 6 feet 9 inches tall and was 300 pounds. So not becoming a trooper didn't really put a damper on him hanging out with the local law enforcement. They'd often hang out drinking beer together at a local bar called the Jury Room.
It's not unheard
Go
of.
for it.
Rusty Pistachio, quick story time. Guitarist for punk rock band H2O, was shot in his teenage years by a younger teenager.
Mm-hmm.
The guy was convicted with, I believe it was attempted murder, but he was like 14 or 15. Served his time, got out, and then a few years later, 4 or 5 years down the road, Rusty ran into him, and the guy was a cop.
That's cool.
I think in the Washington, D.C. area.
I mean, it can go either way, right?
Absolutely crazy. But a cop actually saved Rusty's life. Threw him in a patrol car, drove him to the hospital, saved him.
Oh, wow. Yeah,
anyway,
and we know that, like, right? We know about criminals, especially like child criminals. We've talked about this, like the rate of rehabilitation. It depends on the crime, obviously. But we've kind of come leaps and bounds when it comes to psychiatric understanding and things like that we were from where we were at in the mid 1960s. And at that time, he was not raising red flags because he was charming and intelligent. And, we weren't getting down to the root cause of what made you snap and kill your grandparents. It wasn't a rando robbery, right? It was his two grandparents. So like I said, he considered himself, I think later, his own words were that he was a delightful nuisance to the cops because he would get in there and he would start talking to him about the ongoings of the town and the crimes that were going on, and he'd say he'd quote get in their way a little bit, but they were happy to talk to him and they were, kind of pleasant with him, and, that was that. So Ed worked a series of menial jobs before he finally got employment with the state of California division, the highway division, in 1971. So during this time, his relationship with his mom, Clarnell, did not get any better. The psychiatrist, at least, they definitely had that right. It was super hostile and toxic. They had frequent arguments. Their neighbors often overheard them screaming at each other. Ed later described the arguments he had with his mother, stating the following. He said, "My mother and I started right in on horrendous battles, just horrible battles, violent and vicious. I've never been in such a vicious verbal battle with anyone. I would go to fist with the man, but this was my mother, and I couldn't stand the thought of my mother and I doing these things. She insisted on it, and just over stupid things. I remember one roof raiser was over whether or not I should have my teeth cleaned. And he was a grown man at this point, But you're going to decide for yourself, because I'm going to play some clips of Ed talking here in a little bit and what you think when it comes to when he talks about his mother, his demeanor. When he'd finally saved enough money, Ed moved out to live with a friend in Alameda. There he complained of being unable to get away from his mother still because she regularly phoned him. She would just show up on surprise visits. He did have financial difficulties, and so he would have to frequently return back to his mom's apartment in Aptos. So at this point, Ed's in his early 20s, and he had met a female student at a Santa Cruz beach, and the two became engaged in March of 1973. Their engagement lasted about a year, but it was finally broken off due to his second arrest. And when you find out what he was doing, it's good for her. Her parents did request that her name not be revealed to the public. She was reportedly 17 at that time and still in high school. So that same year, he began working for the Highway Division. Ed was actually hit by a car while on his motorcycle. So when this happened, he injured his arm pretty badly. And so he settled just like a financial settlement with them and was given a reward of $15,000. So at that time, that would be equivalent to about $103,000 now. So it was a lot of money he received in that settlement. He had filed a civil suit against the car's driver. So as he was driving around, he picked out a Galaxy, you guys, a 1969 Ford Galaxy. He bought it with part of his settlement money, and he noticed a large number of young women hitchhiking. So as he's driving around, he's starting to observe. He began storing plastic bags, knives, blankets, and handcuffs in his car. He goes on. There are extensive interviews. I'm sure I've not been able to keep up in the chats, but I feel like you guys probably know a lot about this case. He was extensively talked about in every kind of interview, FBI, behavioral analysis stuff, the show Mindhunter, you name it, books, movies, everything about him. So he likes to talk, and he'll tell you about how, like, kind of his thought process as he starts padding his car with these particular items. So he first picked up young women hitchhiking. Then he peacefully let them go. According to Ed, he picked up around 150 of them who were in line with his pattern. But kind of like Jeffrey Dahmer would do, the first fascination was just picking up the hitchhikers, right? This was before he felt homicidal, and so before he felt any kind of sexual urges to go along with that. And he would call his homicidal sexual urges his, quote, little zapples. And he later did began acting on them. So let me play for you a little clip. You guys let me know if you have any trouble hearing it.
I used to get drunk and go sit out in front of the sheriff's department in a parking lot across the street on one of those old concrete parking berms. And I just sit there and say, no, I still can't. The clanging doors, I can still hear them. No, because it'll never open again. So I rationalized that to give up would be insane. To give up would be crazy. I'd be giving away my freedom, and I don't need to. But I look back on that and wish I had earlier when I was saying those things to myself. The people who were later dead wouldn't be. The regret that came later would have not had to be. Those people, not things, those people would still be with their families, with their loved ones. They would have their own families. If I had had the courage to make that decision, instead of painting myself into the corner.
Okay. So did you guys catch that? He actually, a lot of killers we've learned don't do this. He specified that they're not things. These are people. Mm-hmm. And if he'd have stopped himself earlier, he wouldn't have done these things. Do you believe him?
And that's the thing. You'd have to spend a lot of time with him.
A lot of time with him.
He's so intelligent and so manipulative.
He's good.
His first thought may have been like, these are just things, and then go, oh, I can't say things because they're all going to hate me. And right now, I don't want everybody to hate me because I didn't have a whole lot of love growing up. Now I kind of like when people like me.
Oh, he's something else. Here's a picture of his grandmother. If you are an audio listener, you can always view these images. I'll have them up on the on my Instagram page, Andrea Up Late. You can always come back and reference YouTube to see stuff as well. This next picture is a picture that's Clarnell over there, his mother, and that's his grandfather in the middle, and his grandmother on the right. Remember, his grandmother and grandfather were his two first victims when he was a teen. I believe I have the picture, let's see, of when he was first apprehended in his teenage years over the murders of his grandparents, and it may not have loaded. I'll find it either way. And that photo, by the way, was his booking photo when he was arrested that we saw.
Yeah. Okay.
That was when he was 15 or 16. All right. Let's see here. Where were we? There's a lot on here. Okay, cool. So now we're up to May of 72. So on May 7th, 1972, Ed was driving in Berkeley when he picked up two 18-year-old hitchhiking students from Fresno State, Mary Ann Pesci and Anita Mary Lucchesa. He had the pretense of just taking them to Stanford University, but they drove for about an hour, and he was able to reach a secluded wooded area near Alameda. And he was pretty familiar with this area from during his time working with the highway department, right? So he was able to get there without alerting them that he had changed directions from where they had wanted to go. It was there that he handcuffed Pesci and then took the other girl, Lucchesa, and put her in the trunk. He at this time stabs Pesci and strangles her to death. And then he winds up going and getting Lucchesa out of the trunk and kills her in the same way. Again, multiple interviews, he will tell you exactly what his thought process was during that time, almost berating himself a little bit. Kind of like a lot of things he'll say, well, it wasn't like on TV, or this was a lot more difficult than I thought. Or the only time that I've heard him actually talk about one of his victims outside of family members as him being a little, like he got irritated with her. And I think obviously he doesn't have a very good relationship with women. He wanted to. He didn't innately hate women like a lot of these guys do that were belittled by their moms. He actually was like dying for affection, but it wouldn't take much for him to feel like they were belittling him, even if they weren't. So for instance, he tried to strangle the one girl, or I think he pulled out the knife and it was small. And she said something like, when he got it, like the way he says it, he'll say, she said like, oh, what is that? What are you doing? And she was so dismissive. Like he felt like I'm quite sure she was terrified for her life. She wasn't trying to belittle the man, you know what I mean? But that's how he took anything that, came back at him from women. So he's now murdered these two girls by strangling and suffocating. So he later confessed that while he was handcuffing Pesci, that he accidentally brushed the back of his hand against one of her breasts while he was trying to get the handcuffs on, and it embarrassed him. And he said that he said something along the lines of like, whoops, I'm sorry, or something like that after grazing her breast, even though he murdered her minutes later. And then, he was embarrassed by that. Like it really did embarrass him. There's going to be a couple of instances like that we will talk about. He later noted that he chose these two women because they seemed upper middle class, quote, of a better class of people than the scroungy, messy, dirty, smelly hippie types I wasn't interested in. Man's got standards.
Well,
so he put both of the women's bodies in the trunk of his Ford Galaxy. For the record, it was yellow, and the license plate on the back was a customized license plate that just said suck. So do with that what you will. He was stopped on the way back. So he was heading back to his apartment. Okay. So with these two dead girls in the back of the trunk, it's a pretty nasty sight, right? This was not anything too clean. So he's pulled over by a police officer for having a broken taillight. Remind me to get my taillight fixed. I hate for this to happen. But the officer did not detect the corpses in the car. So he was kind of able to get away on a quick traffic stop. His roommate was not at home. Get this, guys. So he takes the bodies into his apartment. He's pretty bold very early on, where he photographs them. There's going to be a lot of necrophilia here, okay? So he has intercourse with the corpses and then dismembers them. So he put the body parts into plastic bags that he later abandoned out in the woods. Before he got rid of their heads in a ravine, He engaged in, so this word is irrumatio. I'm not super sure how to say it. It's IRR is how it starts. Essentially, it's instead of just necrophilia, it's more specifically like oral sex with the decapitated head. So,
Gotcha.
Yep.
I didn't even know there was a word for it.
There's a word for everything, honey.
Yeah.
In August of that year, Pesci's skull was found on Loma Prieta Mountain, and an extensive search failed to turn up the rest of Pesci's remains or even a trace of Lucchesa. So they never found the other girl's remains at all. So I'm going to let you hear another little bit. I'm going to play quite a few little 1 to 2 minute clips of Ed talking, because I feel like it's going to do so much more justice to the story than just me quoting his words. His inflection and his tone or inflection and tone are pretty important here. So let's see. Forgive me while I pull it up.
I haven't talked about that for a lot of years. I'm sure that may have implemented something, that may have gotten something rolling, but along fantasy lines. But it took a lot of years of development along those lines to really get off.
But how are you able to, in 1 minute, have someone's head in your hand, and very shortly thereafter?
Living through a fantasy, however that would relate to that severed head. And then 5 minutes later, I'd put that away, and there'd be a knock on the door, and I'd put it away and answer the door. And the landlady would be there, and we'd discuss it.
Discuss what?
Reality. Her reality, not mine. Some people go crazy at that point. I felt it. It was one hell of a tweak. I mean, to just flip out and not know where I was. To be walking up the stairs with a camera bag that belonged to a young woman that had her severed head in it. Walking up to my apartment, past a happy young couple coming down the stairs who nodded and smiled at me as they went by. Good evening. And they're going out on a date where I'd love to be going. And I'm aware of both of these realities, and the distance between those two is so dramatic, so amazing, so violent, that really, I could feel the wheels squeaking inside. That was really pulling on it. And I imagine at that point some people break. But I didn't literally go insane. I didn't get lost.
Okay, so he is adamant about this, and psychiatrists wind up corroborating this over all the decades. Almost all of them, in fact, feel like he was never actually insane. And so that's what he was saying there. If you paid attention, he would say, I heard a knock, or this lady wanted to talk to me, the landlord or whatever. And he says, and I was talking to her. What was she talking to you about? And he said, reality. And he said, I mean, her reality, not mine. He did not mean that he had lost reality. He was in essentially his own world, is how he looks at it. That he said it was like a little zing, a little whatever, essentially the high that he got from knowing that he's just this close to someone else, and with what he had in his bedroom. And he said, but I never, I was able to enjoy those moments, and I didn't break. And he means he didn't have a psychotic break during that time whatsoever. He remained fully sane. And that's arguably what a lot of the psychiatrists will say was probably the most terrifying thing about him. Is that he wasn't in fact psychotic, or is not currently in fact psychotic. So, all right, let's see where we are, you guys.
It also sounded like he said they were the couple on a date, and I wish I were. Is that what he said? Was she was on a date or something?
Talking about them being happy.
Yeah.
This happy couple. And they don't know also he's walking by them. So he fancied himself also. He had a nice camera and a big camera bag. And this won't be the only time that a decapitated head will be in a camera bag. And that's kind of part of what he'll talk about, is being able to walk past bystanders unbeknownst to them with a woman's head in his camera bag. All right. So on the evening of September 14th, 1972, just to kind of rein it back in really quickly, in 64 is when he killed his grandparents. He goes away to the mental facility for 5 or 6 years. And then everything else we're talking about, these next set of victims, are all in 1 year's time between 72 and 73, almost exactly a year. So on the evening of September 14th of 72, he picked up a 15-year-old. This will be his youngest victim. She was a dance student named Aiko Ku, who had decided to hitchhike to a dance class after missing her bus. He, again, drove her to a remote area. There, he pulled a gun on her before accidentally locking himself out of his car. However, she let him back inside despite the fact that the gun was still in the car. Back inside the car, he proceeded to choke her. He did rape her and kill her. He subsequently packed her body in the trunk of his car and then goes to a nearby bar to have a few drinks. And then he goes back to his apartment. He later confessed that after he left the bar, he opened the trunk of his car and, quote, admired his catch like a fisherman. Back at the apartment, he had intercourse with her corpse and then dismembered and disposed of the remains in a similar manner as his previous 2 victims. So now he's on to number 3, if you don't count his grandparents. Her mother called the police to report the disappearance of her daughter. She put up hundreds of flyers, but she did not receive any response to this. Okay, so now I'm going to play you guys a video. Actually, you'll get to watch Ed talking a little bit. I think it's only like a minute and a half or so long. And tell me when I put it up here, you guys, if you have any trouble hearing it. It's right at 2 minutes, actually.
Car, but it didn't pierce the clothing. So it wasn't that swell a knife anyway. I went out and bought a pawn shop huge knife. And I kept on just mindlessly attacking. She falls back into the trunk. I just killed a young woman. I slammed down the lid of the trunk. She isn't dead, she's dying. And I panicked. I thought, I just locked the car keys in it because I can't find them in my pocket. Oh my God, I locked them in the trunk. I'm kicking on the trunk lid and yanking on it. Oh no, I don't believe this. I started to run and I tripped over the gun that I'd had in my pants that I had totally forgotten was there. I stopped. I said, stop and think. I collected my wits. Check all your pockets. I picked the gun up. I stuck it back in my pants, now remembering I had one. I checked all my pockets, and there's the keys in the back pocket. I never put them in my back pocket. I thought I was pretty slick, and went and tripped all over myself. That first two... Check all your pockets. I picked...
Still going. Okay, so what are you gathering so far from that?
Well, before I get to that, has he ever had any friends? Has he ever had anybody like fully that he cared about or cared about
he
him?
had, and there's not a lot of, maybe there is, but I couldn't find a whole lot. To be fair, I didn't look for a whole lot of information on that serious girl that he potentially was engaged to, but there's not much about that. He talks about going on a date, and to this day, he'll talk about it I say to this day, it was an interview back in the 90s, I guess, but he had said he was almost embarrassed by talking about it because he said, I took her on a date and we went to a John Wayne movie and to Denny's. And he was like, I was such a dork. I mean, he just felt so insecure himself. Mm-hmm. He would sometimes repeat the words that his mother, would call him. And so let's finish the rest of that. Let's see where we were.
Car, but it didn't pierce the clothing. So it wasn't that swell a knife anyway.
Oh, well, it's not going to let me restart. And Brian was reminding me that if a video clip is longer than X amount of seconds, they'll kick us off of a live YouTube. So you get an idea, though, of his cadence, kind of how he is in an interview. He's actually very straightforward. I've not watched one interview with Ed, which I've watched a lot at this point, where I feel like he was being, maybe he's just so good at it, but where I feel like he's being manipulative, or where I feel like he's being boastful. Like Ted Bundy is a great one, right? So he doesn't boast the way some do, but he comes off as slick. He needs you to know more about him and how smart he is and how amazing he is. And Ed doesn't really do that. Or like a John Wayne Gacy just kind of comes off as just like an ass. Like, I don't know. He just doesn't seem like he'd be very fun for anybody to be around, his wife included, like anyone. But Ed really just kind of seems straightforward. And we'll talk about more of his interviews with the FBI and how he was instrumental in a lot of things moving forward. But that kind of gives you an idea as to how he describes his... Here, I think I can...
But it didn't pierce...
So basically, this is what he was saying.
The trunk. She isn't dead. She's dying. And I panicked. I thought, I just locked the car keys in it because I can't find them in my pocket. Oh my God, I locked him in the trunk. I'm kicking on the trunk lid and yanking on it. Oh no, I don't believe this. I started to run and I tripped over the gun that I'd had in my pants that I had totally forgotten was there. I stopped. I said, stop and think. I collected my wits. Check all your pockets. I picked the gun up. I stuck it back in my pants. Now remembering I had one. I checked all my pockets and there's the keys in the back pocket. I never put them in my back pocket. I thought I was pretty slick. And went and tripped all over myself. That first 2 murders, the first 24 hours, there were 3 clear times I should have been busted, and I wasn't. Because 3 different individuals or 3 different groups of people got scared and minded their own business and looked the other way. I was picking up some very lovely young women. You know what we were talking about as we're driving around? Almost as often as not, this guy that's going around doing this stuff. And the second they started talking that, they didn't realize it, but they were getting a free ride. I couldn't touch that with a 10-foot pole, I swear. You know, but they'd be telling me what all about this guy, and they're comparing notes and speculating on what he looks like, how he carries himself, why he's doing this stuff, telling me about it.
So how come they get in a car with somebody at that time?
She judged me not to be that guy.
Woo-wee. She judged me not to be that guy. And if you caught what he just said, first of all, he wasn't boasting when he said 3 separate times, 3 very distinct times right then I should have been caught. And he's saying because he messed up. Not because, cops messed up, because he messed up. And he said, and here I was tripping all over myself, and I was just 24 hours in. And so kind of like realizing like, wait, maybe I don't have this like I thought I did. And he said, I told myself, no, stop, think, check your pocket, get all your things. There are your keys. There's the gun you forgot you had. So he's very, I don't even use the term methodical and like in a bad way in that sense. Just like, I think that that's probably how he goes about, like, this is going to sound terrible. I was going to say kind of the way your brain works though, in the sense of when we go somewhere, when we do anything, you stop and you say, okay, do I have this, like slow down, think, do I have everything? And because of that, I leave something everywhere we go, and you always have everything you need. So, but that's kind of what he's saying, that he learned to like stop and think outside of what he was doing in the midst of this heinous stuff that he had done, and kind of get it together. He also said, unbeknownst to some of these girls, he said, you know what we talk about? The crimes going on in town. And he said, unbeknownst to them, they were getting a free ride, meaning I'll drop them off where they wanted to go and not murder them. Because he said, I wouldn't touch that with a 10-foot pole. He's getting to hear them, speculate and talk about the cases. Yeah. Excuse me. So that's where, let's see.
Yeah,
here.
I think that, anybody can keep an act up for a while, but I don't know. I mean, for years and years and years.
And to not be a psychopath.
Yeah, exactly.
That word seems like generic now, but
it does.
But you know what I'm saying? Like to not have any psychotic tendencies in that way. They will now say, well, we'll talk about it, like some more of his like more affirmative diagnoses. But either way, everyone in the medical, like mental profession seems to believe that, like I said before, that he wasn't breaking. He was not in psychotic breaks during any of this stuff. So on January 7th of 1973, he at this time moved back in with his mother, which I'm not quite sure exactly why, to be fair, because he had that money from the settlement. He had, a good bit of money, but he was driving around the Cabrillo College campus, and he picked up 18-year-old student Cindy Shaw. He drove to a wooded area. Here he shot her with a .22 caliber pistol. Okay, so he's kind of changing. So where he's not the same as a lot we talk about that like escalate, some of his other behaviors escalate, but not necessarily the method. Usually we're not seeing a strangle, stab, and then back to a gun. Unless, like you said, that was the convenience portion or whatnot. He kind of goes back and forth. But I think because you'll learn that for him, it wasn't necessarily, he did have homicidal urges, but that wasn't really what drove him. It was what happened after death that drove him. So I think the manner of death wasn't quite as important to him. He then placed her body in the trunk of his car and drove to his mom's house. Here, he kept her body hidden in a closet in his room overnight. And when his mom left for work the next morning, he had intercourse with the corpse. He then goes so far as to remove the bullet. So this is what we were talking about from Cindy's corpse. So he takes the bullet out of her head and then dismembers and decapitates her in his mom's bathtub. He kept her head for several days. There are some psychiatrists who think that he had a bit more of a longing or a closeness with this particular body. And he regularly would engage in that word, eromatio, with it. And then he buried it. Okay, you guys, I'm sorry. This is terrible. Everything he does is horrible. I'm not condoning any of it. But if there's a sense of being witty with what he's doing, and I only say this because his mom was so horrible. So he finally takes this head after having it for a while, and he buries it in his mom's garden facing upward toward her bedroom. And after his arrest, he states that he did it this way because his mother, quote, always wanted people to look up to her.
Yeah, it's terrible.
Diabolical. He discarded the rest of Shaw's remains by throwing them off a cliff. Over the course of the following few weeks, all except for her head and right hand were discovered and kind of pieced together. A pathologist later determined that he had used a power saw to dismember her. So I'm going to let you listen to a little bit more audio here. Hang on, guys. Sorry. Sometimes these things don't work like I would like for them to.
As gently as I could, I took them where they needed to go, to their college. That was 1 week before I murdered my mother. I said, she's got to die, and I've got to die, or girls like that are going to die. And that's when I decided I'm going to murder my mother. I knew a week before she died, I was going to kill her. And she went out to a party, she got soused, she came home, went to sleep. I was woken up by that. Came out. I walked up to her bed. She's laying there reading a paperback. As many thousands of nights before. And she said, oh, I suppose you're going to want to sit up all night and talk now. Shit. I looked at her. I said, no. I said, good night. And I knew I was going to kill her, you know? And I'm so cold, it's so hard. And that's the first time in 10 years I've looked at it that way. I mean, that intensely, that honestly. It hurts. Because I'm not a lizard, I'm not from under a rock. I came out of her vagina. See? Came out of my mother. And in a rage, I went right back in. For 7 years, she said, I haven't had sex with a man because of you. My murderous son is one of our arguments. I cut off her head, and I humiliated her corpse. It's there, you know? A 6 young woman dead because of the way she raises her son and the way her son is raised, the way he grows up. And what's her closing words? I suppose you want to sit up all night and talk. God, I wish I had.
Yeah, that's a lot. Let me get her face off of there. Let's see here. Yeah, so that's just a lot to unpack. Clearly, he fully believes that everything he did to these other girls, you know, wouldn't have happened had his mother not raised him the way she did. We're going to talk about this stuff. You know, this isn't like excuse time. That doesn't give him an excuse to do what he did. But this is what we were talking about before. What came first, the chicken or the egg? Was it that he was born already with a brain a little predisposed to go sideways, to have these tendencies, and that was further nurtured by his mother's abhorrent parenting? You know, or was it because of that his brain got rewired? And we've talked about this one at length, and I do believe that we agree it was kind of a perfect storm. He was obviously exhibiting some pretty concerning behavior early on as a young child. And around that same time is when his mom was doing some pretty bad things to him. So I think it all kind of came together like that. But I will tell you this, that I've read extensive reports on like the behavior unit from the FBI who went back and dissected that tape to watch. If you watch it, you can watch it and see him when he reacts the way he did. And no one has had to say, or no one has said anything other than this was like, no one thinks it's malingering. Everyone believes that to be a true response of his. Whether you believe that's justified, it doesn't matter. But his reaction to it, the only time he will get emotional is when he's talking about his mother. And he'll even say like that, and she said it again, she said it again. What do you want to just sit up and talk all night? And he's like, I wish I did. I wish I did. Go ahead.
No, I didn't know. I don't want to jump to it yet.
Well, I was just going to talk about like essentially, and I'm not going to get into the details of them, but they go very specifically into these micro expressions as he's speaking about, particularly about his mom. About like a nasal flare, a tightening, an upper lip curl type of thing, and like this little huff of the cheeks that like shows like a true emotion. Yeah. But go ahead.
Yeah, just from even listening to it, and that's what I was going to say. Later tonight, I just say that that even from just listening to that and going, that sounded authentic, and then seeing it, or even the best part is when you're in the room. And you can actually watch, and then of course you feel it, and then you go back and you watch video over and over and over and over. But I do we want to talk about some stuff that Douglas said or no?
Yes, in a moment.
Yeah, I'll wait.
I think I did on accident skipped over one of my slides, but it's just two other victims where he had gotten a heated argument with his mom, and there was like heightened suspicion of a serial killer preying on hitchhikers in the Santa Cruz area. So students have been advised to accept rides only from cars with university stickers on them. Well, what do we know about him? Since his mom worked as an administrative assistant there at at UCSC, then he had a sticker. He had a tag. He looked like he could be a student there or a professor or whatever. And so he encountered on two different occasions on this one car ride, 23-year-old Rosalind Thorpe and 20-year-old Alice Liu on the campus. And according to Ed, he first encountered Thorpe as she exited a building. She entered the passenger seat and believed him to be a fellow student. So they just start chit-chatting amicably. Shortly after he runs into Allison Liu, who was thumbing a ride. So he stops the vehicle. She pops in. She probably just assumes the other two are a couple. And eventually he slows the car. He shoots the passenger with his .22. And then while he's driving, turns around, shoots the other victim that's sitting in the back seat. He then wraps them in blankets and brings them back to his mom's house. This time he beheaded them in his car, and he carried their corpses into mom's house to do all the things that he does with them, dismembered them, again removed the bullets to prevent identification, and discarded their remains the next morning. So this is tough. When questioned in an interview as to why he decapitated his victims, he explained, the head trip fantasies were a bit like a trophy. The head's where everything's at, the brain, the eyes, the mouth, that's the person. I remember being told as a kid, you cut off the head and the body dies. The body's nothing after the head's cut off. Well, that's not quite true. There's a lot left in the girl's body without the head. And so then I think this is the last little bit of audio that I haven't played for you guys.
Obvious access day or night to the campus. I was picking up some very lovely young women. You know what we were talking about as we're driving around?
You know what? We actually played that on the other clip, so that's fine. That's where he's talking about they'd get a free ride. Essentially, they would not die if they get in the car and are talking about the crimes going on. So after he does what he did to his mother, so you heard his own words as to what he had done to her, and it's pretty graphic. But he did take a hammer. I'm not sure if he actually did he speak that part in there, but he stood over her. Her death was much more graphic. It was obviously, I hate to say the word more personal because people always say that, but it was so more personal in nature than these other, like the co-ed, because he's also known as the co-ed killer. So these girls from these campuses, right? So let me see here so I can make sure that I'm reading you properly. Okay. So, excuse me. He does what he does to his mom. He stands over her bed after she'd kind of passed out. She'd been at a bar drinking all night, comes back. They get into that verbal exchange. He stands over her with a hammer, and he said he mustered all his strength. And I think he says, and I caved her head in or something like that. I bashed her head in, which, again, you guys, did you see his pictures? Like, he's giant. Please don't let his size, like, be lost on you. 6'9", 300 pounds. The dude is huge. I think mom was like 6 feet even. So she was very small compared to him, but, you know, not also a very small woman just in nature. And his dad's like 6'8". So that's kind of where he gets his size from. But he stands over her, bashes her head in with the hammer, and then did everything else he did with her. He also, it gets more intense because he says that he put her head on a shelf and screamed at it for an hour. And then he threw darts at it. And ultimately, he smashed her face in. So also pretty graphic, but he cut out her tongue and larynx. So your larynx is where your voice box is located, right? So when I talked about his symbolism and the stuff that he did, he put them in the garbage disposal. However, this is terrible. The garbage disposal couldn't quite break down like the vocal cords, the cartilage very well, and it ejected it back out and into the sink. And he says, quote, "That seemed appropriate as much as she'd bitched and screamed and yelled at me over so many years."
Wow.
So he hid his mom's corpse in a closet and went to drink at a nearby bar. Upon his return, he invited his mother's best friend, 59-year-old Sarah Taylor, or Sally Hallett, over to the house to have dinner and watch a movie. When she gets there, he strangled her and subsequently put her corpse in a closet, obscured any outward signs of a disturbance, and left a note to the police. So I'm about to read you that note to police, but that's the one that for the longest time confused me. That was the one that didn't make sense. His mom's best friend, like, why after the fact? Because he will say to this day that the murder of his mother ended it all. Like, that was it. Everything else culminated into that initial desire of getting rid of her. But the note to the police read, approximately 5:15 a.m. Saturday. No need for her to suffer anymore at the hands of this horrible, murderous butcher. So after the killing of his grandparents, this is mom's best friend, and this must be how best friend refers to him. And so again, in his note to police, he says, "It was quick, asleep, the way I wanted it, not sloppy and incomplete, gents, just a lack of time. I got things to do." Oof. So after this, he flees the scene, and we say flee. You know, this particular source is written flees the scene. He had a plan in place. He drove nonstop to Pueblo, Colorado. So he took like NoDoz, like all these caffeine pills, to stay awake because it was about a 1,000-mile drive. He had 3 guns, hundreds of rounds of ammo in his car. He thought at this time he was the target of an active manhunt. He wasn't, like, at all. So after not hearing any news on the radio about the murders of his mother and her friend, when he arrived in Pueblo, Colorado, he found a phone booth and called the police. So he calls back to the Santa Cruz Police Department, where, remember, he tried to work alongside those guys, and when he couldn't get that job, he drank at the bar with them. So they knew him. They referred to him as Big Ed. That's how he got his nickname, was from that police department. So he calls the police there and confessed to the murders of his mom and her friend Sally, but they didn't take him seriously. They didn't believe him. They're like, "No, dude." Like, and at first they thought it was a prank. And then when he told them who he was, they didn't believe him. And they told him to call back some other time. So he waited a few hours. He calls again. At this time, he asked to speak to an officer he personally knew. So he confessed to that officer of killing his mom and Sally. And then he waited for the police to arrive and take him into custody. And then once they came and, you know, took him in, he then confessed to the murders of those 6 students. Which I'm not sure they would know about, you know, especially at that time. We talk about this. So later in an interview, he was asked why he turned himself in, and he said the original purpose was gone. It wasn't serving any physical or real or emotional purpose. It was just a pure waste of time. Emotionally, I just couldn't handle it any longer. Toward the end there, I started feeling the folly of the whole damn thing, and at the point of near exhaustion, near collapse, I just said to hell with it and called it all off. He was indicted on 8 counts of first-degree murder on May 7th of 1973. He was assigned the chief public defender of Santa Cruz County. and he gave a very explicit and detailed confession. So, I mean, there's really nothing you can do. A defense attorney is going to defense attorney, I guess, but there's not a whole lot you can do with what he says. So they tried to get him off on like not guilty by reasons of insanity, but he can't be found insane. And there's clinical insanity and legal insanity for sure, but none of which really applied. So 3 court-appointed psychiatrists found him to be legally sane. On November 8th, the 6-man, 6-woman jury deliberated for about 5 hours and declared him sane and guilty on all counts. He asked for the death penalty, requesting death by torture. But there had been a moratorium placed on capital punishment at that time, so that no capital punishment was an option in terms of the Supreme Court of California. And instead, he received 7 years to life. Essentially, he got 8 concurrent life prison sentences. And he is there in the California Medical Facility in Vacaville. So let's see here. This is interesting. So shortly after he gets there to that medical facility in Vacaville, he admitted to psychiatrists. He was admitted, to psychiatrists for reevaluation. At this point, they diagnosed him with antisocial, narcissistic, and maybe schizotypal personality disorder. So these are all personality disorders. These are not like psychopathic disorders. Like he's still not insane. Okay. In fact, yeah, it's a whole different kind of thing. So it's going to be a lesser than, if you will, on these charts. So, but listen to this. If you were to be in that California medical facility in the late 60s, early 70s, the amount of people you'd be there. He was imprisoned on the same block as Charles Manson, Herbert Mullen. So get this, Herbert Mullen was another serial killer in Santa Cruz at that same time during the same year that he was active. The difference is Herbert Mullen was incredibly crazy. Like, so he was paranoid schizophrenic. He fully believed that he thought that the Vietnam War was accounting for enough deaths so as to discount any new earthquakes that would come upon California. And that once Vietnam ended, he had to take it upon himself to start murdering to keep the earthquakes at bay. So that's the Herbert Mullen guy. Okay? So when I say he was another serial killer, a very, very different thing. But as one can maybe imagine with an Ed Kemper, he couldn't stand that dude. He didn't say much one way or another about Charles Manson. I don't think he was it sounds terrible. I don't think Ed was a big fan of Charles Manson either. But in reference to this Herbert Mullen, evidently this is what Ed Kemper says about Herbert Mullen. He said he described Mullen as just a cold-blooded killer, killing everybody he saw for no good reason. Ed manipulated and physically intimidated this is so funny. Mullen, who was like 5'9", right? So he's a full foot shorter than Ed. And he said that Herbert Mullen had a habit of singing and bothering people when somebody tried to watch TV. He said, so I would throw water on him to shut him up. But then when he was a good boy, I'd give him peanuts. Herbie liked peanuts. He called him Herbie. He said that was effective because pretty soon he asked permission to sing. This is what we called behavior modification treatment.
Yeah. I could see him clashing.
It wasn't wrong when Pavlov did it. Okay.
Yeah, right. I could see him clashing with Charles Manson as well.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
That ego and all that. And I'm quite sure he'd look at him like, no, dirty hippie.
Well, dirty hippie. And also just like
you're not
the idea.
Well,
and they have those grandiose because they're crazy. So like they think like God sent me to do this, or I'm doing this to offbeat earthquakes. He's like, no, you idiot. No, you're not, you know. But he feels, I can't even say that he feels justified. He's gone back to say like, well, let me just read you what he says. So he remains among the general population in prison. He's considered a model prisoner. He has been since he was admitted. He's in charge of scheduling he's a little sicker now, but he was in charge of scheduling other inmates' appointments with psychiatrists. So he would schedule their psychiatric appointments. He was an accomplished craftsman of ceramic cups. He was a prolific narrator of audiobooks for a charity program that prepared material for the visually impaired. So he read all these audiobooks for blind people. He was the coordinator of the prison's program, and he personally had spent over 5,000 hours narrating books with several hundred completed recordings to his name. So I think he spent like 30 hours a week or so, give or take, reading for these audiobooks. He was retired from these positions in 2015 after he experienced a stroke and was declared medically disabled. He received his first rules violation report in 2016 for failing to provide a urine sample. I mean,
wow.
While imprisoned, he has participated in a number of interviews, including a segment in the documentary The Killing of America. Multiple. Well, I'm not going to read them all. You can find them. So multiple interviews, documentaries. But his interviews have contributed to the understanding of the mind of serial killers. So the FBI profiler, John Douglas, which we'll talk about, described Kemper as among the brightest prison inmates he's ever interviewed, and that he was capable of rare insight for a violent criminal. He further added that he actually personally liked Kemper, referring to him as friendly, open, sensitive, and having a good sense of humor. I'll let you say what Robert Ressler has said, because that's the next part of this.
You got that. I
You
don't
sure?
have anything Ressler. Yeah, just
Oh, okay. So evidently Robert Ressler, so these are all the FBI, kind of like the spearheads of the behavioral analysis unit for the FBI, right? And so Robert Ressler changed how the FBI conducted interviews with serial killers. According to Ann Burgess, Ed Kemper told Ressler at the end of one of their interviews, "The guard isn't coming back. They're on change of shift. He's not going to be here for about 30 minutes. In that time, I could snap your head and leave it on the table. I'd own the prison then, right? I killed an FBI agent." After the guard came back, Kemper laughed and said he was just kidding. Regardless, FBI agents were required then to conduct interviews in pairs and could no longer do this alone. So Ed is forthcoming about the nature of his crimes. He has stated since that he participated in the interviews to save others like himself from killing. So take this for what you will, if you believe it or not. But he said at the end of one of the interviews that there's somebody out there, I guarantee you, that's watching this and hasn't done that, hasn't killed people, but wants to, and rages inside and struggles with that feeling, or is so sure they have it under control. They need to talk to somebody about it. Trust somebody enough to sit down and talk about something that isn't a crime. Thinking that way isn't a crime. Doing it isn't just a crime. It's a horrible thing. It doesn't know when to quit, and it can't be stopped easily once it starts. So he has been up for parole multiple times since 1973. And finally, at this point, he's wheelchair bound. I mean, he's in a diaper. He's got diabetes, coronary heart disease. And interestingly enough, in April 2024, psychiatric evaluation classified him as high risk to reoffend. I mean, he physically really kind of couldn't now, but I guess they think that he could tend toward that. The only actual violation he's had was in 2022 when a prison worker was changing his diaper and he reached out and grabbed the butt of the prison worker. And when asked why he did that, he said, I don't know, to change the mood up a little bit. I mean, what are you going to take away from me at this point? But he's not tried to harm anyone. He's actually not tried to, I'm not taking his, whatever, but I'm just saying that, he says it. He was like, my mom, I realize now that, again, you guys, this is not making any excuses, but that's how he looks at it in his head. I likely wouldn't have killed these other people had, that stuff not happened. So in his brain, everything was symbolic of his mom, just meaning that by the time he killed her, he was done. That was it. He really didn't have any desire. And a super creepy thing, because we talk about this, we talk about serial killers in other countries, or the rampant nature it seemed like in the 70s. And it's well, we can't pretend like that doesn't currently exist. And when he was asked about it then, sometime, I think in one of his 19, he's got some bigger interviews in 81 and 91. And they said, do you think there are other people like you out there? And he was like, oh yeah. And I think somebody quoted a number 10 or something. Actually, in this particular interview, there was some French interviewer that said 10 or something like, maybe do you think even 100? And he said, oh, I would have told you 110 years ago. And they say, why do you think that is? Or why did you turn yourself in? Why did they not? Or why don't we know that they exist? And he said, oh, because they're still out in the cold. They're not ready. He said, I was ready to come in from the cold. I was done. And so, but I think if your brain works that way, it's very much easier to understand that other people's brains could work that way as well.
Yeah, and I think that I would imagine a guy that intelligent could probably spot some of that behavior being around people.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Like we talk about,
Of course.
you know, like we watch people are like, these are some scam artists, or when they, you know, just how
Kidney
people behave.
stealers.
Yes. Yeah, Douglas talked about guys who do that, who get fixated on their mothers, all this anger, and then they kill women that are kind of like surrogates, you know, hoping and still wanting either on the subconscious level that their mother will still give them love.
Mm-hmm. So
until they eventually either kill their mother or get captured and then they can't.
So it's very similar. So Ed has actually come back to say that, like, there's something, and the psychiatrist evaluating him. And in fact, it could have been, instead of a psychiatrist, one of those guys, but saying that, like, everything he did was like a warning to his mom. Like, that's why he's getting more and more angry with her. Like, why can't she stop being mean? Because when he would kill a girl, even though his mom didn't know he did it, it's almost like he took it as like that's a warning. Like, don't do it.
I got you.
Like, he got mad at his mother that he had come to the conclusion that he was going to kill her because he didn't want to. Or, you know, so he'll say, like, I didn't want it to end like that. And that's why he starts crying in that interview. And he said, and because he mentions it twice, how she had said, you're just going to want to sit up and talk, aren't you? And he starts to cry and he says, I wish I did.
Yeah. Yeah, because if he's always, this is the thing too.
But she's also telling him that because of him, she hasn't had sex with a man in 7 years. I mean, just
right.
Ugh.
And so that idea that I think even people who have grown up with abusive parents, you know, are not predisposed to that. He showed early on that he had some issues, you know.
Well, and so we talk about, because we've had people in chats that say, hey, a loved one, you know, someone I know had a horrible past and would never do anything like that. And we talk about it time and time again. We talk about victims that go on to do amazing things. Like, obviously that doesn't make you, you know, a horrible childhood, a horrible mother doesn't make you do these things. But if you already maybe have some rewiring in your brain, or you're wired a certain kind of way, and then you have that kind of, that's where you have nature and nurture. And then I will always argue that there's a third component that's just you. And like, when you have those two like that, it's the you piece is going to be the perfect storm. So we do have a few pictures. I've shown you most of them. It is almost insanity. I can say 6'9", you know, we all know basketball. We all know, we've seen tall people, but to see him walking around amongst average sized people is just, it just doesn't almost look real. But look, I mean, his belt line here is up to the chest pocket of the cop behind him.
Yeah.
God. And then there are all these series of weird photos that were taken. Oh, this is an interesting one, guys. Check this out. So this is going to be, he took them to the scene. If you can look in the top right picture, the gentleman all the way to the left is Ed in kind of a white jumpsuit. What is hard to distinguish in this picture is he's wearing a belt with the handcuffs out front. He's smoking a cigarette, hand on his hip. They're at the scene of one of where he dumped one of the bodies. So he was taking them around to show them where everything. This was never a mystery. He was never one like, you'll never find her, or I'll never. Yeah. He also didn't try to boast or make it sound like he did more than he did. He just showed him exactly where they were and who it was, and that was that. This is when he was 15, 16, after murdering his grandparents, the first arrest. Here he is with some guards there later on. Again, you've seen this one in a car. Again, if you are just, if you're listening through an audio stream, we will have these pictures up on the Andrea Uplate Instagram page. Let's see here. It's hard to see what I've already shown you until I pull it all the way back up. But, oh, here's a better one of him at the scene showing them. It just doesn't even look real. Like, it looks like it's out of a movie.
Yeah. And I think it's, you know, just him, like, hanging out in those bars and talking to cops and
Yeah, they were his.
yeah, just him.
Some of them were his drinking buddies. I mean,
Yeah.
or had been.
And I think it's wild that he was drawn to that early on, like wanted to be a cop.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the scary thing. Like, what if he would have been hired?
That's a tough picture there. His eyes look fully dark.
Yeah. But, if he's already got that stuff going on.
So he talks about when he was 15, when that happened with his grandparents. And he says, in his mind, he considers, the murder of his grandfather to have been an easement for him. He didn't want his grandfather to suffer in seeing what had happened to the grandmother. Okay. So, and he says, like, thank God we were where we were at that awful ranch, that awful place that they lived. He didn't like living there, but he was saying, thank God we were up there. We were 2 miles away from anything else on top of this hill. And he said, I was essentially, he will say that he painted himself in a corner when he did that. So all of a sudden his rage took over. And then he said, and then I would have killed anything in my sight. He said, there would have been a mass murder and I would have been cooked, but not out of rage. He said, because I would think everybody that sees me is coming to get me to because I'm good for this. I did this. And he said, I was 15. I wasn't able then to control my rage and to control my urges or to control my, settle down my angst or my worry. And so he was able to say, and that's what the psychiatrist will say, that call it what you will, what makes him kind of one of the more interesting killers in that sense, or scary, is that he is so self-aware. He can fully articulate how he was feeling throughout the whole time and why. And he'll say, well, imagine I got what I wanted and they executed me early on, because that is what he had wanted. And he said, I wouldn't have been able to, I guess, talk to them to maybe help others. And so he really did seem to pride himself in his time talking with Ressler and Douglas and all that. And like they said, their whole job is to analyze behavior. And they were like, look, this doesn't mean he's a good guy, that we got along with him. This doesn't mean that we think anything he did was okay, that we got along with him and got this information out of him. But it's been very helpful toward the program over the years. And he's been studied at great length.
Well, that's like, with Douglas saying he liked him, and they had great rapport. And in another section, one of his books, he's like, basically could care less about Ted Bundy. He's like, yeah.
See, I wouldn't. And we talk, I know this sounds, don't take this to mean that any of this is good or anything like, I don't know. Like, I'm not saying any of these things to say that I'm okay with any of the horrible, horrible things he did. I do think his mom was a horrible woman. And so while I hate that she was a victim the way that she was, it can get a little quirky the way he does things. Like when he planted the head in her garden facing up at her and he was like, yeah, she always wanted everybody to look up to her, just like and that's what they said. He had a good, that's not a good sense of humor, but he was witty, I will say. Yeah. After the fact, his one-liners, I guess, is my point. Yeah. But, when we talk about, if you give a list of like a Dahmer, a Bundy, a Gacy, whatever, go back and look at Dahmer, watch some of his interviews, watch him talk. And how we discussed it, it actually has been later discussed that he was certainly probably Asperger's on the spectrum somewhere, which when you called it immediately. But Dahmer's one that I think, I don't know. If he were still alive, I would feel perfectly safe sitting, beside him. He wanted to get caught. He knew he just couldn't control his thing. It was a dark urge that he says he wasn't actually, he didn't take pleasure in. Bundy just wants to sell you something all the time. Like I said, Gacy always just seems like just kind of a jerk. Like he seems like he'd be like the jerk uncle. Like he just always like seemed like ugh. But,
which would be absolutely tough if you're going in and doing things like Douglas and Ressler do when you're interviewing people or talking to people, building rapport, spending hours and hours and hours talking, and you can't stand the person, like everything about him. Aside
he was boastful. Gacy was very boastful, very arrogant.
Well, I mean, like, aside from all the crimes, like if someone met Ted Bundy, and when I say someone who knows behavior, like me and you people like, that person's a damn con artist or whatever. Just
full of it.
I think you'd see right through Bundy inside of probably 5 seconds.
For sure.
He's that guy with that kind of slightly smile that lasts
He's always
a little
smart.
too long. Yeah. I don't know. But I think to the average person, he came across so polished.
Yeah.
You know, that people
Oh, yeah.
just
They
like,
just thought
my
he was
God.
slick and smart and,
Yeah.
you know, charismatic. And it's like, and I do think people have kind of come a long way in learning a little bit more about behavior because by now all these programs
Yeah.
have developed and kind of been worked on and whatever. I did make a little list because I was curious about, you know, we kind of joke about certain things that, you know, I don't know. I've got like a little spoof of a reel that I put up ages ago where Drew Breezy and I are talking, or Andrew Baxter, or whoever he is this week. And, you know, and again, I forget that I like have said the third person's name during that show, and each person who was like the killer has 3 names, like they go by, you know, so-and-so, so-and-so, you know, John Wayne Gacy, right? Like whatever. And so there are different things that kind of, it doesn't indicate, but you can kind of find, you know, that it, I don't know, that it correlates with other killers. So I was looking at height, and really, you don't have a ton like this. You don't have a ton this tall in general, but you've got Ed. As far as I know, in America, in modern times, he's the tallest of the killers. But then I did do a show on Keith Jesperson a couple of years ago. He was like the happy face killer or whatever. And he was 6'8". So very, very close. 6'7", 6'8", depending on the source. But so very, very close behind him. And then you got a couple 6'1". So Jeffrey was 6 on the dot. John Wayne Gacy was 5'9". We've talked
how
about
much
the.
did he weigh?
He was rotund. And then we've talked about the triad, right? So either the homicide triad, the McDonald triad. It can be named multiple things. It's because a doctor or a psychiatrist named it, but his last name was McDonald, so it can be referred to as that. But that would just be where you have like the 3 elements that arguably can show you a potential increased rate in either violent sexual crimes or homicides, particularly in serial homicides. And so that would be your setting fires, bedwetting excessively after the age of 5, and harming animals. And so they would argue that if you have at least 2 of these, it could correspond with a higher incidence of something like that later in life. People will argue it and debunk it and say it's kind of, you know, junk science, that it's not, you know, it's like counting on hypnotizing to whatever, you know, like that it's not really pure science. It's not hard science. But I think that you can argue that if you're just looking at numbers, there's a very good reason why that was ever discovered and looked at that way.
Yeah.
Right. So on diagnoses, if you just want to compare a couple, again, Jeffrey Dahmer was likely Asperger's or some form of autism spectrum disorder. At what point Ed Kemper got the passive aggressive type personality trait disturbance. So basically a passive aggressive disorder. It wouldn't be in the in the DSM-5. It wouldn't be like in a psychiatric manual in the sense of a psychiatric illness, because he was not, he didn't have like psychopathic tendencies like that. He was a sane person, or is a sane person. But again, think about that part of California when I said at the beginning of the show, you know, kind of culturally what was going on, globally, politically what was going on. Brian gave you some pop culture references. But at that time, Santa Cruz was being called the murder capital of the world. And you're just coming off the heels of Manson straight into that Herbert Mullen, Ed Kemper. There's another guy, John Lindley Frazier, who in 1970, he also, though, was like, he was another one that was like a schizophrenic type, you know, God told me to whatever, and like annihilates an entire family and then someone else. So everyone in that town is like, they don't know who's doing it. So they don't know, you know, we just know that girls are getting wiped off of, you know, college campuses, this whole family in this house, of course, all the Manson stuff, you know, so there was a lot of that going on. But I did like the peanut behavior training with old Herbie. He said, when Herbie was a good boy, I'd toss him a peanut. Herbie liked peanuts.
Well, I mean, hey.
And look, you don't have to be a manipulative serial killer to know that that's behavioral modification, right? Like we learned that in school. So anyway, I'm not going to keep you good citizens.
I think it probably could drive him crazy to have a IQ that high. If he's around inmates who aren't reading, who aren't, you know, bettering themselves, or to just kind of like, you know.
He got in there. He was arrested in 1973 for his mother's murder. It's 2025. So, and now he's too kind of frail to do a whole lot. But until just recently, like I said, he was able to get around. He had jobs there until he had his stroke. And so, I mean, it's just like anything else. As long as you show your worth, if you're not misbehaving and acting up and causing trouble, you get to have these privileges. And he did through all the decades. So, I mean, I think that should speak for something. Not that he's a good guy, but that kind of what he was saying is true. Like, he kind of feels wrapped up with it. He's done. Like, he kind of ended it with his mom.
Yeah.
Now, we might have found something else out if he were able to have somehow gotten out 20 years ago while he was still a little healthy.
Or never turned himself
Who knows?
in. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So, hey, everybody that's still hanging in the chats, we're dwindling. It's getting a little bit late, and you guys have been patient. It's been a bit of a long-winded show. Let's see here. What are y'all talking about? Oh, are y'all talking about Mindhunter maybe in the chats?
Yes, there were references to the actor. Earlier, there were references to the actor who played him.
Yeah, and how similar.
And yeah, just what a great job he did.
Well, and Ed went through a phase. I'm not sure if I showed pictures tonight of that, but he went through a phase of gaining a bit of weight and kind of having a rounder face, and that's the time period that actor was portraying him, and they look identical at that time.
Yeah.
We have Rain's Blood in the chats, Tyler S, Brittany Faulkner. We had Bosco. He went to bed, I think. I saw Cupcakes and Cameos a minute ago.
Jimmy Ferrari was in there earlier from
Michael Hendricks, who?
Brooklyn Blast Furnace podcast.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, Jimmy Ferrari. So he just interviews
Ferrari, huh?
What a cool name.
Yeah.
Interviews a lot of like hardcore bands, actors, and stuff.
I know somebody like that.
Yeah. His show is one of the first podcasts I ever listened to.
Oh, nice. Okay.
Yeah.
Rain says he's still here. Tyler's still here. Okay. Fox still here. Tyler, I thought you said you were cleaning a bathroom. Grab Ass 10 is here. Did we determine who that is?
We have no idea. We think we know, but we don't know.
No.
It has not been confirmed.
Or else it's...
There was also someone earlier in the chats who, I mean, I don't know whether they want me to say it or not, but they're graduating. It's a different person.
Oh, okay.
Graduating and are getting into law enforcement. And so they listen to the show, and we've messaged back and forth off and on for a while now.
Oh,
so
nice.
They got into an academy, got through training, graduating, getting ready to start field training.
Oh, very good. Congratulations. Yeah, very good.
They know who they are. If they don't know, then they need to learn to enjoy life. And that's cool. Mm-hmm.
Well, do you have anything you want to share?
Episode last week dropped on Wednesday, and that was Brent Waterworth. That was the Palisades Fire. He's also the guitarist, lead singer of Taken Days. And then tomorrow...
So just real quick, he's lead singer of a band, right? And then also is a firefighter, and was called out, had to cancel shows like with his band to then fight the fires in the Palisades, which he, just like everyone else at that time when it first happened, had no idea the magnitude, the amount of days he'd be gone doing that. So I won't spoil anything else, but it's an interesting interview that Ryan has with him for sure.
So that one was up last week. And then tomorrow, Wednesday, interviewed undercover detective Matt Pitcher.
Oh, nice.
And he went undercover in the South, in the Charlotte area in North Carolina, and infiltrated a domestic terrorist group. And they were plotting or a bomb plot that was going on for the DNC back whenever that was in Charlotte. What was that 2016 or something?
Probably.
I can't remember. But he goes in depth with all of that. He's gone under and worked the mafia of some sort. We'll do that episode in the future, and did a lot of undercover like street buys and stuff.
Oh,
so
he's got
I think it's like 20 something years maybe on with law enforcement. Really cool guy, fun to talk to. So there'll be a few episodes with him, but that one drops tomorrow.
Well, very cool. So if you guys don't know, Brian Sanders, like I said, is a retired homicide lieutenant. So that's why it's so great to have him on this show for true crime. But he has his own show called The Disruptors with Brian Sanders. And so it's more of what I call it a variety show. And that might make it sound more comical than it is or something. But It's just literally a variety of guests. So you name it, be it people in law enforcement, nothing to do with law enforcement, bands, actors, undercover,
Gang
infiltrating,
members.
gang members. Yeah. So we have a friend that's always in the chats. Carly recently said that he needed what did she say? An emotional support
Informant.
informant. And I said, well, funny you should say that because he
Yeah.
has one. And every now and then they'll, every
Yeah.
now and then they'll
You gotta keep in
chit chat.
touch with people. Yeah.
Of course. So, but either way, you can follow him over there again on Instagram at The Disruptors with Brian Sanders. You can find him on the YouTube channel of the same name. He also has a website called
The Disruptors with Brian Sanders.com. Yeah.
One of these days, you'd think I didn't know the guy. So do that. We've got there's some things that need to be worked on in the shop in terms of getting rid of some old stuff, Christmas stuff, and adding in some new stuff. But check out Illicit Apparel Daily Threads if you want to help the show out. That would be super dope. And we'd really love that. So I don't think actually you do have on
I had
shirt.
I had a request recently for, I don't know if you can see that. But I had a request recently to make zip up hoodies.
Oh, yeah.
And I
possible.
didn't know anybody was wearing them anymore. You know what I mean? Like people are like, hey, why don't y'all do zip up hoodies? I'm like, well, I don't know. See? You know?
Yeah, we can check that out. So Illicit Apparel, Daily Threads. And again, you can follow me over on this channel that you're already on. If you are watching on YouTube, it's the Andrea Up Late YouTube channel. And then on Instagram with the same name. You're always welcome to email us. If you don't want to send a message or don't have social media, it's just AndreaUplate@yahoo.com. So it's as easy as possible. And you can recommend show ideas if you have questions, if you have whatever. Again, I know I keep talking about it, but we just covered again the latest updates in Ellen Greenberg, and that actually received a lot of traction. A lot of people, in the sense of it's current, and it's a lot of people have very strong feelings about it, and because of that, that's helped make waves. And so, definitely go back and check that out if you guys haven't listened to that, or comment on the Instagram post about it or the YouTube channel. So, we'd love to. We'd love to hear from you. So we always want your input, and we appreciate you guys more than you know. And so I think with that, I don't have anything really super new to talk about. Do you have anything you want to tell anybody? You get it all out of your system?
Yeah, I did.
And let us know if you guys want us to cover stuff like this again. Like the bigger, kind of more well-known cases. Like I said before, I enjoy doing the stuff that's not so well known and telling you something you may not have heard of or bringing light to something that needs more attention. But every blue moon we can do some of these like this, these already solved, well-known cases. Either way, we love y'all and we appreciate you as always, more than you know. Would you like to tell the people good night?
Yes. Good night, everybody.
Every single time, do you know that you look over here and say good night, everybody?
To you or to
I think to me.
To you?
To them, to me, yeah. By proxy.
I guess I'll look next time.
Adjacent. All right, we got Eric in the house. Eric Kemper in the house. What's up, buddy?
Man? Tomorrow or Thursday?
Oh, y'all are?
Call.
Oh, okay.
Just at least talk on the phone. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Well, welcome, buddy.
Tried to do it last week, and I think we got a little bit busy.
Okay.
Stuff. So.
Yeah, it was a busy week. Okay, well, either way, we love you guys. We appreciate you. Appreciate your support. Always shoot an email, send a message. We love talking to you. So I guess that should wrap it up. And until next time, we will see y'all next Tuesday. You good?
Yeah, I'm good.
All right. Good night, y'all.